My name is Kjell Andersson, and as I was introduced, I have worked with the Swedish Bioenergy Association for quite some time, where I work with communications and policy advising. SVEBIO is a slightly older organization than the Irish Bioenergy Association. We were founded in 1980, and I think we are the oldest European bioenergy association. We have about 300 member companies, and we work with all kinds of biomass in the whole bioenergy supply chain. We have a couple of magazines, one in Swedish and one is international. Just going to show it to you. It's called Bioenergy International, and it comes 7 times a year. And the editor is actually Irish, Alan Sherrard, but he lives in Sweden. And we organize conferences and so forth. It's rather similar to this organization. So my subject is going to be about how bioenergy became the major leading energy source in Sweden. I'm going to talk a bit about district heating and about carbon taxation, 2 subjects that are essential to this development. And I'm a little bit surprised that you haven't talked more about that, but I heard some good arguments for district heating, and I'm happy for that. This is the current energy use in Sweden. As you can see, bioenergy is the biggest. This is counted or calculated the way, almost the same way as the European Union Renewable Energy Directive does it. It's a little bit different, but it's only marginal. So it's kind of, you look here on how the energy is used. It's seen from the user side, and then we have divided it up from all the different energy sources. So with nuclear power, for example, which is a rather big share of the Swedish energy use, we have deducted all of the heat losses. They are sometimes also counted, which makes it very confusing when you compare international statistics. But this is the end use divided up according or final use divided up according to the sources. And then bioenergy is the biggest, with about 125 terawatt hours, or a little more than a third of the energy use in Sweden. We passed oil in 2009. This is all kinds of energy, including transport, heating, processes in industry, and electricity, all of it. You can also see that hydropower is quite big, and wind power has been growing steadily during the last few years. And if you then summarize those renewable energy sources, we are well above 50% today renewable. Here you can see the development of bioenergy between 1983 and 2013. Also before 83, there was a steady growth. But what is apparent here, or obvious, is that we have had a steady, step-by-step growth of the bioenergy sector. It hasn't been done quickly and in a short time, but it's grown over the time. And the dark green down there is the sector where we've had the biggest growth, and that is the use in district heating. The light green on top of that is use of bioenergy in the forestry industry mainly. We use huge amounts of bioenergy for those processes. Black liquor, different kinds of byproducts that are combusted for the processes to make pulp and paper. Well, I couldn't, I had to bring this one. It shows how different countries in the European Union have managed to reach the targets according to the Renewable Energy Directive. And you can see Ireland as 5th from the bottom there. The light green is what the countries had reached in 2013. And the green staple there is the target for 2020. And there is a group of countries at the bottom there, the small countries Luxembourg and Malta, but particularly the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Ireland, that are struggling to get close to their targets. And then at the other end, you can see countries like Sweden. We have already passed the target several years ago. We were supposed to reach 49%. We are now at 53%. Also Latvia, Finland, Austria are doing quite well, although they haven't reached the target. Estonia has passed the target too. What is typical of all these countries to the left on this chart is that they are countries with a lot of bioenergy, all of them. And they also have a lot of forestry, many of them. But Denmark is a country with rather little forestry, but still high up here. So we'll have another presentation about Denmark. They are doing quite well, despite the fact that they don't have a lot of forest. So it isn't so simple as to say that if you have forest, then it's easy. This is what we call the decoupling chart. It shows how Sweden has reduced carbon dioxide emissions from 1990 until 2014 by about 25%. At the same time, the economy has grown by 60%, and the major factor behind this decoupling is that the bioenergy use in that period has more than doubled. What has made this development possible? I think these are the factors, major factors. We have had long-term and stable incentives. That is very important. That the investors can be sure that these incentives are in place and they will be in the long run. We have had broad political support across the party lines for these kind of policies. We have a carbon tax based on the polluter pays principle. So fossil fuels that emit or at their combustion produce carbon dioxide, they have to pay their environmental cost. This is a natural part of a sound economy, that if you pollute, then you have to compensate for it or pay for it. So we introduced this carbon tax in 1990, or it started in 1991. I'll come back to that. We have had rather limited use of direct subsidies. We have not had any feed-in tariffs or very little, like your your heat incentives, things like that, where you pay individuals or companies to do something. Instead, we have steered the market with a carbon taxation, which makes it very inexpensive for the government to administrate this. We have no fossil fuel resources in Sweden and no strong fossil fuel lobby. This is similar to Ireland, of course, so that's not a difference from your country, but it's a big difference to countries like Britain or Poland or others where they have fossil fuels. We have a very strong forest industry and strong forest owners association, and they have helped promoting the use of bioenergy. And district heating was already, when this process started, rather well developed, quite well developed. And I'll come to that now. This is two pictures of the city of Sundsvall. It's located on the northern Swedish coast, about halfway up to northernmost Sweden. And the first picture is from, I think it's from around 1960. And you can see this is a cold winter day with high pressure, minus 20 maybe, or something like that. Everyone is blasting their furnaces with, at that time, coal or coke or heating oil or firewood. And all of them, of course, with technology that wasn't as developed as it is today. This is a city with about 80,000 people. It's located in a valley with mountain ranges on both sides, and then the Baltic is out to the left there. And then you can see a picture from today, or a few years ago, a similar winter day. And this is the effect of having changed or taken away maybe 500 or 1,000 individual chimneys in this city, and replacing them with one heat plant and one chimney with good flue gas cleaning. You see the air is crisp, clear. Of course, they still have cars, but the cars have also become better through these years. What I'm trying to tell with this picture is that the main driving force behind district heating in Sweden was at the beginning not security of supply or climate. The climate issue wasn't even known at the time, and it was, but it was environmental concerns. Here you can see the fuels used in the district heating systems. So you can see here in 1970 we already had quite a lot of district heating, and at that time it was completely fueled with fuel oil, rather heavy oils often. And in 1973 we had the first oil crisis when the supply was cut off by and OPEC was founded. Sweden, we had at that time an import dependency of 80% of our total energy supply or use was from imported oil from the Middle East, most of it. And it was, of course, we were very vulnerable at that time. And the oil, of course, the reason for this was that oil was so cheap that no one bothered about it. Even farmers out in the countryside had thrown out their old firewood boilers and instead bought an oil burner. But this started the process of thinking among Swedish politicians and administrators. We had to do something about this. And they talked and talked for a couple of years, and very little happened, of course, as it always does. But in 1979, we had the second oil crisis with Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. And everyone said, well, why didn't we do something in the middle time here? Because we realized we were in the same position in 1979. So that started the process. And they started giving incentives for switching fuels in boilers. And at the first stage here, they even gave support to switching to coal boilers. That's the black here. And we started working with peat quite a lot. It's including in the green here. So peat and coal were the first answers. And why didn't we go for biomass from the forestry? Well, it was because the forest lobby at that time was very strong, and they thought that using biomass for energy would compete with them, with their raw material base, and that the prices would go up. So they lobbied against it. A little bit similar to how it's now lobbied against agricultural fuels. After some time, though, they realized that coal was not the future, and the climate debate started in the late 1980s. In 1992, we had the big environmental meeting in Rio, and later on we had the Kyoto Protocol. But already in 1990, Parliament in Sweden decided to introduce the carbon dioxide tax. And because there had been a debate about this, that people who polluted, they would have to pay for it. And there was an agreement, we had a big tax reform at the time, and there was an agreement that we would also have environmental taxes beside income taxes and property taxes and so forth. So this was introduced in 1991, this new tax, decided 1990 by the Parliament. And then you can see from that time on, coal decreases, oil goes back even more, and biomass starts growing steadily in district heating, because district heating had to pay the full carbon price. And now, today, we are up at biofuels account for more than almost 75% of all fuels in district heating. And the rest of it is, lots of the rest is waste water from industries and large heat pumps, often working towards or with sewage water. So almost all of this is renewable now. We have one coal plant left in Stockholm and 2 natural gas plants left. The rest is biomass. And some of it is also waste, which we count as biomass because most of it is biogenic, household waste. And as we have so many good heat plants and heat and power plants, there is also a big demand for fuel. And the utilities, they try to keep down the cost. So they try to switch from biomass today over to recycled wood and to waste. And guess where they get the waste? Most of it comes from Sweden, but some of it is imported from Norway, from Britain, and even from Ireland. And we who work with the forest fuels, we are not so happy about this. We think that every country should burn its own waste, municipal waste, and use it for heat and electricity. So what are we using? What kind of biomasses are we using in district heating? We are using byproducts from sawmills and pulp factories, bark, sawdust, chips, discarded wood, shavings. We use forest residues out in the forests, tops and branches, stumps, small trees from thinnings, trees of low value. This picture shows a pile of forest residues out on a felling. And one of the biggest, not so high-tech inventions, but one of the biggest and most important inventions was when someone thought about putting a piece of paper on top of this pile to keep the rainwater out. It meant that the drying of this wood over a summer would go so much quicker, and we got much, much higher quality of these chips that we got from forest residues. And it has saved hundreds of millions for the Swedish heat plants. Of course, we have material from parks and gardens, pellets, briquettes, recycled wood. Bio-oil, we use quite a lot of bio-oil as top load when it's extra cold, because the carbon dioxide tax is so high that it makes sense also to switch from that little oil we used to use as peak load. We had a program in the 1970s and 80s to research and develop short rotation coppice production using willows. Professor Gustav Sirén was the front runner of this. And they planted at the time about 12,000 to 15,000 hectares. We haven't planted so much more since then, partly because we have such an abundance of biomass. People will tell you sometimes that this is a limited resource. We have never experienced in Sweden that biomass is a limited resource. Even the very coldest winters, it's been possible to always get more biomass on the market. There is always much more out there than any researcher will ever tell you. So the willows have never been able to compete very well on the market. But the system is quite good, and our researchers have made some very good breeds of this salix. So you can buy that if you want to. Electricity production, we have started developing electricity production more and more, mainly through CHPs, combined heat and power, as much as we can. But still, the electricity market is dominated by nuclear power and hydropower. But the nuclear reactors, they are aging quickly, so they are going to close down 4 of the remaining 10 reactors within the next 3-4 years. And then biopower will have a good chance, because biopower has the advantage of being what you call dispatchable. Is that the word? You can steer it. You have instead of having to invest in a very expensive battery, you have the battery in the fuel. We made a comparison. I can go back to this one. A Tesla battery, I think it can store up to 10 kilowatt hours or something. 18. Yeah, 18. You know, that's not very much. You know, you can, if you run a stove is like maybe 1 kilowatt or a few hours. It's a very small amount of energy. If you compare that to the energy you have in chips, for example, you take a container full of Solix chips. Do you know how much energy there is in that compared to these Tesla batteries? 2,500 times much more energy in a container of chips than in a Tesla battery. Of course, the battery you can charge over and over and over, so it's not really a fair comparison. But you have to remember that fuels can hold extremely high amounts of energy, like a diesel in a truck. It's hard to switch to batteries because then you have to load the whole truck with batteries, more or less. But that's another subject. Sorry, I shouldn't have talked about that even. I hadn't planned. This is the carbon tax. This is the carbon tax introduced in 1991. And right away, after they had, from the beginning, it was 25 Swedish öre, which is about 2.5 euro cents per kilogram. It was the same for all sectors of society, because we said that regardless of if you're industry or domestic or so forth, you still have the same pollution and the same cost. But the industry organizations, they started lobbying right away and said that we can't do this because we are going to lose all competitiveness on the market, world market, and we are, you know, all the jobs we're going to lose, and so forth and so on. So they decided in Parliament to reduce the carbon tax for industry, and that's the green one, and then they raised it even more for the households. Swedish households are not very, they are very, what shall I say, tolerant towards taxes. And then we have had different levels all the way, and the industry never, you know, they didn't increase the tax very much there. Instead, stood steady there at a rather low level, where on the other hand, the carbon tax for households was increased drastically between 2001 and 2005. That was what we call the tax shift, a green tax shift. And what we did was we lowered income taxes, and at the same time we increased the carbon tax. And people accepted that. So now we have a carbon tax that is 4 times as high as in any other country anywhere in the world. And now the last few years we have started increasing the tax rate also for industry and other parts of business, except for the companies who are part of the European emission trading scheme, ETS, because they don't pay any carbon tax. They are supposed to be incentivized through ETS. Of course, the result of this is that everyone else, all the small people in the society, are paying very high for the carbon emissions, whereas the big emitters, electricity producers and particularly heavy industry, they don't pay almost anything. And by the way, the emission rights, they went down from 8 to 6 euros last week. So it's a catastrophic situation on ETS. So now we are all these small industries are getting a higher carbon tax. I'm supposed to quit here rather soon, but I will say a little bit about the effects of this carbon tax. Today we have about 450 heat plants for district heating, and 9 using biomass, and about 90 of them also have electricity production, CHPs. The use of oil for heating of buildings has decreased from 30.9 terawatt hours in 1990 to 1.6 in 2014. It's about, how many percent is that? That's almost down to nothing. The emissions from heating has decreased from 9.48 million tons of CO2 down to 1.34. The total emissions there, they have decreased by 83%. This is just one example of one of these business sectors where the carbon tax now is increased rather drastically. That's the greenhouses. They have gone in a few years from fossil fuels to biofuels and waste heat. Also here, the use of fossil fuels has decreased by 83% during the last 12 years. And the use of biomass has increased drastically. They use either pellets or wood chips. At the same, some people say, well, if you use so much biomass, then of course you are taking it out of the forest, and this is not sustainable. This is not carbon neutral, and so forth. At the same time, though, the stock of carbon, biogenic carbon in the forest, has continued to increase year by year. We have more than twice as much carbon in our forests today as we had 100 years ago or 90 years ago, and it continues to grow. This is an example. There's more, there's so much more forest and so much more vegetation in every country in Europe today than there used to be. Everywhere. You go to Italy, you go to any country. Much more forest, much more vegetation, which is also a good argument that you can use much more bioenergy. That's a postcard, the upper one, that I found of a church in western Sweden from 1902. There was not a single tree or bush on all this. It was barren. The landscape was completely barren because of grazing and using firewood and so forth. I tried to take the same picture a couple of years ago, and I could hardly see the church from the same point because there is so much vegetation. Sustainability criteria. Time is up. That's another speech. Sorry, but maybe I could get back to that, or can I do it very, very quickly? I am chairman of this group in SVEBIO. We think it's important that the business sector here, that we have an offer, that we are proactive in this debate, and therefore we have made a proposal for a system, and the most difficult thing here is to make a criteria for sustainable forest management. It is not included in the Renewable Energy Directive for the liquid fuels, but we need to have something for it for the solid fuels. And we need to, we think, rely on existing systems, because we have that in every country. We have forestry legislation. Therefore, we are talking about a risk assessment approach where we use this risk assessment as an umbrella under which we can then also analyze national legislations, other kinds of sustainability systems, and certifications systems. You can read this afterwards when you probably get access to these slides. And we hope that we can find a system here that the European Union, the Commission can accept, that the Parliament can accept, and that also the bioenergy business sector can accept. And that doesn't give too much new bureaucracy to the small-scale forest owners. We have 15 million forest owners in Europe, and we don't want to make this impossible to work for them. Well, I think I will quit there. And thank you very much for your attention.